The alien city was burning with bright fire that reached into the dark sky, and the air was thick with smoke and dust, and the smell of destruction was everywhere, and the streets were broken and full of fallen stone and broken metal, and the sound of screams and the sound of enemy weapons was all around, and the once great city of the Drevians was now only a shadow of what it had been, and still the battle went on. Commander Rolter stood on the highest wall of the last stronghold, and his armor was scratched and stained, and his breathing was heavy as he watched the horizon where the enemy swarmed like a black tide rolling forward without end. And he could see no ships in the sky and no reinforcements coming to their aid, and he knew that the small army behind him could not hold for much longer, and yet he would not run, and he would not surrender, because the Drevians had always fought to the very end. Below him, the enemy moved forward step by step, and they were the Zarkal swarm with their hard shells and sharp claws and endless hunger for conquest, and they had destroyed world after world, leaving only ash and silence. And now they were here at the gates of the Drevian capital, ready to finish what they had started, and nothing in this city could stop them, or so it seemed. The civilians were trapped inside the walls, and many of them huddled together in the dark corridors of the fortress, whispering prayers to old gods, or holding the hands of loved ones. And the soldiers stood ready with weapons in hand, though they knew that the end was close and that no miracle would come to save them, because they had sent their call for help long ago, and no one had answered, and no one ever would, or so they believed. Rolter felt the weight of every life in the city pressing on his shoulders, and he thought of the message they had sent across the stars asking for aid from anyone who could hear. But days had passed, and then weeks, and the only reply had been silence. And in that silence the enemy had come, and now the walls shook with the force of their attack, and Rolter knew the next breach would be the last. He raised his hand and gave the order for the final defense, and the soldiers moved into position along the wall, ready to fire their weapons, and a fight in the streets if the gates fell, and the sound of enemy claws scraping against the metal gates filled the air like the grinding of knives against stone, and the civilians began to cry out, and even the bravest among them felt their courage begin to fade. Then it happened. A deep sound rolled through the air like distant thunder, and at first it was so faint that Rolter thought it might be his imagination or the echo of some distant explosion, but then it came again, louder this time, and the walls seemed to vibrate with its power, and it was not the sound of Zarkal weapons, and it was not the sound of anything the Drevians had ever heard before. The enemy paused in their attack, and for a moment the battlefield was silent, except for the low rumble in the air, and soldiers on both sides looked up at the sky, trying to see what had made the sound, but the clouds above were thick and black from smoke, and nothing could be seen. Rolter narrowed his eyes and waited, and his heart beat faster, because something about the sound felt strange and heavy, as if the very air was being torn apart, and then another sound joined it, a sharp roar like wind rushing past metal, and it was getting closer. The enemy began to shift uneasily, and some of them hissed in warning, as if they sensed danger from above, and the civilians inside the fortress whispered to each other, afraid to hope, but unable to look away from the dark clouds above the city, and still the sound grew louder and closer. Through the swirling smoke, shapes began to appear, faint at first, and then sharper, and they were moving fast, and they were large, and they were made of metal, and light glinted off their surfaces as they broke through the cloud cover, and Rolter felt a strange shiver run down his spine, because these shapes were like nothing he had seen before. They came in a formation tight and perfect, and the sound of their engines was now a deafening roar that filled the entire sky, and every soldier on the wall stopped and stared, and even the enemy forgot their attack as they watched the sky tear open to reveal these strange craft. Rolter could see their dark steel hulls and the strange markings painted on their sides, and their movement was so precise and so powerful that he knew they were not merchants or smugglers or any of the smaller factions in the galaxy, and his mind raced through every possibility until one answer began to form, though he did not yet dare to believe it. The largest of the craft came down lower, its shadow falling over the wall and over the battlefield, and the wind from its descent shook the banners and flags, and threw dust into the air, and Rolter could feel the vibration through the stone under his feet, and it filled him with a sense of something vast and unstoppable. The enemy fired at the craft, but their shots bounced off the thick armor and the ships did not slow. They came lower and lower until Rolter could see the massive doors on their sides, and he realized they were opening, and inside was only darkness at first, but then movement. Figures began to appear inside the open bays, and they stood tall and strong with armor as black as the void and strange symbols glowing faintly on their chests, and their weapons were already in hand. And then, without hesitation, they jumped. They fell like meteors, their armored forms cutting through the air, and the force of their landing shook the ground and crushed the enemy soldiers who had been unlucky enough to be in their path. And the moment they touched the ground, they moved with deadly speed, striking at the Zarkal with a skill and power that Rolter had never seen before, and every blow cut down another enemy, and every shot sent more of them to the ground. Rolter stared from the wall, unable to speak, and his soldiers stood frozen as they watched these warriors tear through the enemy lines. And in that moment, the Drevians felt something they had not felt in a long time. Hope. The warriors who had fallen from the sky did not stop for a single breath, and their black armor glinted with strange blue light as they moved between enemy soldiers like shadows that had come alive, and each movement was fast and precise, as if every strike was already decided before it began, and the Drevians on the walls could not look away, because this was not just battle, this was something greater, something frightening, and yet also a reason to hope. The Zarkal swarm had fought many enemies across many worlds, and they had crushed every defense they had faced, but now for the first time they hesitated and their lines broke apart as they tried to understand what these new fighters were, and the sound of their claws scraping against stone was now joined by the heavy thud of armored boots hitting the ground, and the hiss of energy weapons burning through their ranks. Rolter shouted for his soldiers to open the gates and join the attack. And at first they could not move because they were still in shock for what they had just seen, but then the noise of battle pulled them back into motion, and the great gates opened with a deep groan, and the Drevian warriors charged forward to fight alongside the strangers from the sky. Up close, the human warriors were even more terrifying than they had seemed from a wall, and they stood taller than most Drevians with armor that looked thick, but somehow moved as if it weighed nothing, and their helmets had smooth, dark visors that hid their faces, making them seem less like people and more like living machines, and their weapons spat bursts of fire and light that cut through the Zarkal like blades through thin cloth. One of the Drevians fought his way close enough to see the mark on a human shoulder, and it was a simple shape, a circle crossed by a sword, and it glowed faintly, as if lit from within, and the sight of it burned itself into his mind, and he knew he would remember it until his last breath. The air was filled with the crash of weapons and the screams of the enemy, and the humans never seemed to slow and never seemed to miss, and even when a Zarkal leapt on one of them from behind, the warrior turned and slammed a fist into the creature's chest with such force that the hard shell cracked, and the enemy collapsed without a sound, and the human was already moving toward the next target. Rolter himself joined the fight, and for the first time in days he felt the enemy give ground before him, and it was not because of his own blade, but because the Zarkal were being torn apart on every side, and their formations were falling into chaos, and he realized that these humans were not only strong, but also working together with perfect coordination, as if every fighter could hear the thoughts of the others. Above the battlefield, the great ships still hovered in the air, and their dark forms moved slowly through the smoke and ash, and sometimes they fired down on the enemy, sending blasts of white light that melted stone and left nothing where the Zarkal had stood, and the sky seemed alive with the roar of their engines. The Drevians had fought for survival for weeks, and they had known only fear and loss, but now something had changed in the air, and even the wounded soldiers rose to their feet and took up weapons to fight again, because they could see the Zarkal stepping back, and they could feel the tide turning. One human warrior fought his way to the very front, and he carried a weapon unlike any the Drevians had ever seen, and it fired bursts of light that passed through armor and left nothing but smoking holes in the enemy ranks, and he did not stop moving forward, even as claws slashed at him and teeth snapped near his neck, and it seemed as if nothing could touch him. The Zarkal commander roared from behind his forces and pointed a long claw at the humans, and more of the swarm rushed forward, trying to overwhelm them with sheer numbers, but the humans formed a line and held their ground, and their weapons spoke again and again with bright flashes that burned into the eyes of every soldier on the field. Roltaire moved closer to them during a break in the fighting, and he shouted to the nearest human, asking who they were and why they had come, and the warrior turned slightly, and his visor reflected the flames of the burning city, and in a voice deep and steady he answered, "Earth forces hold the line." Nothing more was said, and then the human turned back into the battle, and his weapon spoke again, and Roltaire felt the words echo in his mind because he had heard of Earth, but only as a distant and quiet world far from the great conflicts of the galaxy. And yet here they were standing in the heart of his ruined city, fighting as if it was their own home. The Drevians pressed forward beside them, and each step pushed the enemy back, and the ground was slick with the remains of the fallen, and the air was hot from fire and from the energy of the weapons. But no one stopped, and no one thought of retreat, because the humans showed no fear, and the Drevians would not shame themselves by showing less courage than their new allies. The clouds above swirled as if the sky itself was watching, and sometimes a flash of light passed through them as more dropships moved into position, and Roltaire wondered just how many human warriors had come, and if there were more waiting beyond the clouds, ready to fall like thunder into the heart of the enemy. One moment, the Zarkul pushed forward, and the next they fell back, and their movements grew less certain as the humans cut through their leaders and broke their formations, and even the most fearsome of the enemy fighters began to hesitate before stepping in a range of the black armored warriors who moved with such deadly precision. The sound of battle rolled across the city and into the broken streets where civilians hid, and when they heard the strange roar of the human weapons and the deep boom of their ships, they began to believe that maybe the city would not fall today, and maybe the enemy would not break through the last wall, and maybe the end they had feared would not come after all. Still the fight raged, and the smoke grew thicker and the sky darker, but the humans kept moving forward, and every step they took was another step that the Zarkul lost. And in that steady push, the Drevians found the strength to keep fighting no matter how tired or wounded they were, because they could see with their own eyes that the impossible was happening and that the day was not yet lost. The great dropships in the sky moved lower, as if the clouds themselves were falling toward the burning city, and their massive shapes blocked the faint light that came through the smoke, and the sound of their engines was a deep, endless roar that rolled through the battlefield like the voice of a storm, and every soldier, both Drevian and Zarkul, looked up for a moment, caught between fear and awe at the sight. One of the ships opened its side, and inside was darkness at first, but then movement appeared, and the movement grew into the shapes of more warriors in the same black armor as the ones already on the ground, and their weapons were ready in their hands, and their glowing blue symbols burned through the haze like cold fire. And the moment the doors opened, they began to drop one by one into the battle below. They fell without fear and without slowing, and the force of their landing broke stone and threw dust high into the air, and every time they touched the ground, an enemy soldier fell with them crushed or struck down before they could react, and it was as if the sky itself was hurling spears of living steel into the heart of the swarm. Roltaire could hardly follow their movements, for they were too fast and too precise, and it seemed as if each human knew where every enemy would be before the fight even began, and they struck with a rhythm like the beating of a great war drum, and every blow and every shot was part of that rhythm until the battlefield itself seemed to move to their pace. One human landed near the wall, where Roltaire stood, and for a moment the commander could see the strange armor up close, and it was not like any metal he had known, for it seemed to bend and shift with the warrior's movement. Yet it also took the full force of enemy claws without breaking, and the glowing circle and sword on the chest seemed alive with a faint pulse of light that matched the sound of the engines above. The human looked at him through the dark visor and gave a small nod before turning and charging into the nearest group of Zarkul, and with a single sweep of his weapon he cut down 3 of them, and then rolled forward and drove a glowing blade into the chest of the 4th, and the body collapsed without a sound, and the human was already moving to the next target. More dropships were arriving now, and the sky was alive with their shapes, and the enemy began to understand that this was no small rescue force, but something far greater, and their roars and hisses grew louder as they tried to rally against the new arrivals, but for every step they took forward, the humans took 2 steps more and forced them back again. The civilians inside the fortress could hear the sound of battle changing, and it no longer sounded like the desperate defense it had been for days, but like an attack being driven with purpose and strength. And some of them began to climb to the higher points of the walls just to see the strange warriors who had come from the sky. And when they saw them, they felt the first spark of hope since the siege had begun. The humans fought in small groups, never alone, and each group moved as one body with no wasted motion and no hesitation. And if one warrior was attacked from behind, another was already there to block the blow before it landed. And their weapons were unlike anything in the galaxy, with barrels that glowed before each shot and blades that cut through armor, as if it were paper, and strange devices on their wrists that sent bursts of energy into the ground, knocking enemies off their feet. Rolter saw one group of humans push straight into the center of the enemy formation. And though the Zarkal outnumbered them 10-1, they never slowed and never faltered. And when the Drevians saw this, they too pushed harder, and soon the enemy found themselves being attacked from every side, and their advance toward the gates turned into a slow retreat. In the middle of the chaos, a figure stepped down from one of the largest dropships, and this one wore the same black armor, but with silver lines running along the plates, and a larger version of the glowing symbol on the chest. And even the other humans seemed to move aside slightly to give space as this figure passed, and Rolter guessed that this was their leader. The leader moved with a calm, sure pace and did not rush, though the battle raged around them. And when they reached the front, they drew a weapon from their back, a long blade that seemed to hum with power, and with the first swing it cut through 3 enemies in a single motion, leaving a streak of glowing light in the air that slowly faded. The Drevians had seen many battles and many fighters, but nothing like this, and Rolter felt that he was seeing the work of soldiers who had trained for a purpose far beyond ordinary war, and he began to wonder if perhaps the stories he had heard of humans being fierce protectors and dangerous foes were not just stories after all. The leader gave a short order in a language Rolter could not understand, and at once the humans shifted their positions and began to push the enemy toward the east side of the field, and it was done so quickly and so precisely that the Zarkal had no time to adapt, and soon they were being herded into a narrow space where their numbers could not help them, and their roars of rage became cries of panic. Above the battlefield, the dropships circled slowly, and some fired down with heavy bursts of energy that tore holes into the ground and left nothing standing, while others hovered low and released more warriors into the fight, and the entire battle began to turn like a wheel with the humans at its center, driving everything around them with relentless force. Rolter felt a strange mix of relief and unease, for though these warriors had come to save them, they were so powerful and so exact in their movements that he could not imagine what they might do if they ever came as enemies instead. And yet in this moment, they were the only thing keeping the city from falling, and he knew that whatever their reason for being here, it was enough for now. The enemy was still fighting with all their fury, but their attacks had lost the sharp edge of confidence, and the humans pressed on without pause, and the Drevians followed them into the open field beyond the gates, where the Zarkal had gathered in their greatest numbers, and there the battle reached a new level of chaos, as the two forces crashed together again and again under the shadow of the ships above. Through it all, the humans never stopped moving forward and never allowed the enemy to push them back, and it seemed to Rolter that they fought as if this was not a battle they might win or lose, but a task they had already decided to complete, and nothing in the galaxy would change that. The field outside the Drevian gates was chaos and fire, and the sky above was still heavy with the dark shapes of the human dropships, and their steady movement made them seem like silent watchers over the fight below, and the Zarkal swarm still roared and clawed and bit, but the power they had carried into the siege was fading with every moment as the black armored warriors from Earth pressed forward without fear. Rolter pushed into the fight with his soldiers at his side, and each step forward brought him closer to the strange humans who fought like no other warriors in the galaxy, and the Drevians moved in their wake, striking at the enemies the humans had thrown off balance, and for the first time since the siege began, they were the ones forcing the swarm back instead of the other way around, and the feeling of that change filled every Drevian with new strength. The leader of the human forces moved like a shadow of steel and light, and the silver lines on their armor caught the glow of burning buildings and reflected it in sharp flashes as they cut through the enemy lines, and every strike of their long blades seemed to break not only bodies, but also the will of those who stood against them, and the Zarkul near the leader began to pull back rather than face the weapon's reach. More human warriors dropped from the sky, and each landing shook the ground and scattered enemies nearby, and their weapons flashed again and again, sending bursts of blue and white light through the dark haze of smoke, and the air was thick with the sound of impacts and the shouts of orders from both sides as each force fought to control the field. Roltair saw a group of Zarkul soldiers try to flank the humans from the left, but before they could close in, a smaller team of humans broke from the main line and intercepted them, and the humans moved so quickly that the enemy could not recover, and in less than a breath the flank was gone, and the Drevians on that side cheered and surged forward to close the gap. The swarm's largest ground beasts entered the field, now massive creatures with hides as thick as stone and claws as long as a Drevian's arm, and their roar rolled through the field like a wave of pure rage, and they charged with enough force to crush stone walls. Yet the humans did not break or scatter, and instead they shifted their formation and began to move in a way that drew the beasts toward the center. Explosions burst at the feet of the beasts as humans threw small glowing charges that stuck to the ground and the legs of the monsters, and the moment enough of them were in place, a human at the center raised a hand, and a single bright flash tore through the field, and the beast stumbled and fell, leaving the enemy line open and vulnerable. Roltair could hardly believe what he was seeing, for every move the humans made seemed planned and measured, as if they had studied this battle long before it began, and each time the enemy tried something new, the humans were already ready to counter it. And the Drevians had never fought beside an ally like this, and it was as if they were being carried by a great river of strength that could not be stopped. The fight pressed farther from the gates, and the Drevians began to reclaim ground they had lost days before, and the burned ruins of their outer district now stood between them and the retreating enemy. And even though the air was still hot and full of smoke, the sight of the enemy stepping back filled every fighter with fresh courage. One human passed close to Roltair during the fight, and their armor was scarred from claws and burned in places from energy blasts, yet they moved without hesitation, and when a Zarkul leapt at them from behind, they spun and drove a short glowing blade into its neck before it could even land, and then turned back toward the enemy ahead, as if nothing had happened. The leader of the humans gave another short command in their strange language, and the humans shifted again, moving their forces into a wide arc that began to close around the enemy like a tightening net. And the Zarkul saw this and tried to break out, but the Drevians were there blocking their way and striking with renewed fury, and every escape was cut off before it could begin. The dropships above moved lower now, and their heavy weapons opened fire, sending great blasts into the enemy rear lines and tearing holes through their formations, and the noise was so loud that it shook dust from the walls of the fortress even at this distance, and the Zarkul cries of pain and anger were drowned in the roar of engines and explosions. Roltair knew the battle was turning completely, and he could see it in the way the enemy no longer moved as one, but in scattered groups, and in the way their champions were falling one after another to the black armored warriors, and in the way the ground was littered with the broken forms of those who had once seemed unstoppable. The Drevians fought harder now, with the knowledge that this was their chance to end the siege, and they pressed forward alongside the humans, striking and blocking and holding the line wherever it began to weaken, and the field was now a storm of motion and sound where every step was one with blood, and every breath was heavy with the smell of fire and metal. One massive Zarkul champion still stood at the far end of the field, its armored hide glowing from heat, and its eyes fixed on a human leader, and it roared a challenge and began to move forward, crushing the bodies of its own kind beneath its feet. But the leader only raised the long, glowing blade and stepped forward to meet it, and the two forces around them paused, as if the entire battle was holding its breath. The champion swung with a claw that could have torn a wall apart, but the leader moved aside, and the blade struck deep into the monster's side, sending a spray of black fluid into the air, and the champion roared again and attacked with even greater fury, but the leader was faster and struck again and again until the great form fell to the ground, shaking the earth beneath it. The fall of the champion sent a shock through the enemy lines, and more of them began to pull back now, their cries turning from rage to fear and the humans pressed this advantage without pause, and the Drevians matched their speed, and together they drove the enemy farther from the gates until the field was nearly clear, and the only Zarkal left were those too slow to escape. Rolter stood in the smoke and heat of the battlefield and looked at the humans who still moved with purpose even as the enemy was breaking, and he knew then that this day would be remembered not only for the victory, but for the way it had been won with warriors from a distant world who had come when all seemed lost and had turned the tide like a force from the heavens. The battlefield had grown quieter now, though the air was still filled with smoke and the smell of burnt metal, and the ground was scattered with the remains of the enemy, and the broken weapons they had left behind, and the black armored warriors from Earth stood among the Drevians like walls of steel that nothing had moved all day, and yet even in this moment of victory they did not relax, and they did not remove their helmets, and their dark visors hid every sign of emotion. Rolter stepped forward through the heat and the dust until he stood near the human leader, and for a moment they simply looked at one another with the glow of the fires around them and the shadow of the great dropships passing overhead, and Rolter could see his own reflection in the smooth visor of the leader's helmet, and in that reflection he saw a weary commander and a city almost lost and an army that had been saved by forces they did not know. "You came from a sky when we thought all was over," he said, his voice rough from the fight and from the smoke, and the leader tilted their head slightly, as if weighing the answer before speaking. "We received your call." Rolter's eyes narrowed, because the message had been sent many cycles ago, and no answer had come, and in that time the Zarkal had closed in, and the city had been brought to the edge of ruin. And now these humans stood here as if they had been waiting for the right moment to appear, and he could not understand why they had come so late. "It was weeks ago," he said. "We thought no one heard." "We heard," the leader replied, and their voice was calm and even and seemed to carry something deeper than the words themselves. "We were preparing." Rolter wanted to ask what they had been preparing for and why they had chosen this moment, but before he could speak again, a deep roar sounded from the far side of the field, and a Drevian scout came running through the smoke shouting about a Zarkal beast still alive beyond the ruins, and at once the humans began to move toward the sound without hesitation. Rolter followed them across the broken ground until they reached the edge of the battlefield where the remains of a collapsed tower lay, and beyond it stood the beast, a massive creature with armor thicker than any he had seen, and strange scars across its hide that looked almost like marks from an older battle, and its eyes burned with a deep red light as it turned to face the approaching warriors. The human leader raised a hand, and the warriors spread out in a half circle around the beast, and Rolter could see that each of them was carrying different weapons, some long and heavy, some short and curved, and others that seemed more like tools than weapons, but each moved with purpose, as if they already knew exactly how this fight would end. The beast roared again and charged with a speed that seemed impossible for its size, and the ground shook beneath its feet, but the humans did not scatter, and instead they moved aside at the last moment, letting the beast pass between them. And as it did, they struck at its legs, and at the joints where its armor was weakest, and their blows were precise and powerful, and the beast stumbled, though it did not fall. Rolter saw one of the humans plant a small glowing device on the creature's back and leap away, just as it went off with a bright flash that sent the beast crashing into a wall of rubble, and the humans closed in again, striking at every weak point they could reach, until finally the leader drove their glowing blade into the beast's chest, and the light in its eyes faded, and it fell still. The Drevians watching from a distance cheered, but the humans only stepped back and scanned the area, as if expecting more, and Rolter noticed again that they never seemed to rest and never seemed to lose their focus, and he wondered what kind of training or life could create warriors who moved and fought like this. As they walked back toward the city, Rolter moved beside the leader once more and asked why they had chosen to come to the Drevians' aid at all, since the two worlds had never been allies and had barely traded in the past, and the leader looked toward the sky before answering. "Because one day we may need you to come for us." The words hung in the air between them, and Rolter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind or the fading heat of battle, because the way the leader said it made him think that whatever had brought these warriors here today was part of something far larger and far darker than a single siege. When they reached the gates, the humans did not enter the fortress, but instead set up a perimeter just beyond it, and their dropships hovered above like silent guardians, and the Drevians who passed near them looked with awe and curiosity and sometimes fear, because the black armored figures never removed their helmets and never spoke more than they had to, and their presence felt like the edge of a blade resting just above the city. Rolter stood on the wall watching them as the sun began to sink behind the smoke-filled horizon, and he thought of the message they had sent across the stars and how it had found its way to these warriors, and he wondered how many other calls they had answered in other corners of the galaxy and how many battles they had fought without the galaxy ever knowing. That night the Drevians held no celebration for their dead, were too many, and their city was still broken. And though the enemy had been driven away, for now everyone knew they might return, and yet there was a quiet strength in the air, for the people had seen that even in the darkest hour help could come from beyond the stars. In the quiet streets, civilians whispered about the humans, telling each other the small details they had noticed in the heat of battle, the way their armor caught the light, the sound of their weapons, the way they never seemed afraid, and the way they had arrived from the sky like a storm that breaks, without warning, and changes everything in its path. Rolter returned to his quarters, but sleep did not come easily, for his mind kept returning to the leader's words and the way they had spoken them, as if the Drevians and the humans were now bound by something neither had chosen, but both would have to face, and he thought of the unknown dangers that might lie beyond the edge of their maps, waiting for the day when Earth would call for help, and wonder if the Drevians would be ready to answer. Morning came with a cold wind that carried the smell of ash across the city, and the Drevians stood on the walls looking out at the ruined fields beyond, and in the distance the enemy was moving again, and dark shapes shifted through the smoke as the Zarkal swarm prepared for another attack, and it was clear they had not accepted defeat, and they were ready to throw everything they had left of the fortress before retreating for good. The humans were already moving before the sun was high, and their black armored forms gathered near the gates in perfect lines, and the great dropships hovered low above them, casting wide shadows across the ground, and the deep roar of their engines made the stone walls tremble, and the Drevians watched with a mix of awe and fear, for they had never seen such order in any fighting force. Rolter walked among his soldiers, giving short orders to prepare for the coming clash, and he could see the determination in their eyes, for they had fought beside these strange warriors and had seen that victory was possible, and now they would fight to finish the battle once and for all. The enemy advanced in waves, and the first line of the swarm was made of smaller creatures that moved quickly across the broken ground, and their sharp claws scraped against the stone as they climbed over fallen walls and rubble, and the humans met them head-on with bursts of bright light from their rifles and the sharp swing of their glowing blades, and every shot found its mark, and every strike dropped an enemy in its tracks. The Drevians joined them, charging down from the gates into the open field, and the two forces met with a crash that sent dust and sparks into the air, and the sound of the clash rolled like thunder through the valley, and neither side gave an inch in the first moments of the fight. Above them, the dropships fired heavy blasts into the enemy's rear ranks, breaking their formations and sending shockwaves through their lines, and each time a blast landed, the ground shook, and the enemy was thrown into confusion, giving the humans and Drevians the chance to push forward a few more steps. The largest of the Zarkal champions now appeared, and they were armored like living tanks with thick plates covering their bodies and massive claws that could tear through a wall in a single strike, and they roared as they moved forward, crushing their own soldiers underfoot in their hunger to reach the front lines, and the humans responded instantly, shifting their formation to meet the threat. Small teams of humans broke away from the main line and darted between the larger champions, planting glowing charges at their legs and weak points, and each time a charge went off, it left the creature stumbling or falling, and the humans struck quickly to finish it before moving on to the next target, and the Drevians followed their example, focusing their fire on the same points and bringing down enemy after enemy. Rolter fought near the center of the line, and he saw the human leader cutting through the enemy with the long, glowing blade that hummed with each swing, and the silver lines of their armor caught the sunlight as they moved with speed and power, and their strikes were clean and final, leaving no chance for the enemy to recover. The swarm began to pull back slightly, but their largest weapon had yet to appear, and soon a deep rumble rolled across the field, and from the smoke came a creature unlike anything Rolter had seen before, and it was larger than the fortress gates, and its body was covered in jagged spikes and armored plates that looked fused with metal from some older battle, and its many eyes glowed with the same red light as the smaller beasts, but brighter and more furious. The humans moved to face it without hesitation, and the leader gave a short, sharp order that sent several dropships dropping even lower, and from their bays came heavy weapons unlike any that had been used so far, and the humans carried them forward in pairs and began firing at the massive creature's joints and eyes, while smaller teams drew its attention with rapid strikes and bursts of fire. The beast roared and lashed out with claws and spiked limbs, but the humans were too quick, and they moved as one body, shifting and striking in perfect rhythm. And each time the creature turned its head, another team hit it from the opposite side, and the damage began to build until its armor cracked in several places. Rolter saw the moment when the leader made their move, rushing forward under the cover of the other teams, and leaping onto the beast's back with a speed that seemed impossible, and driving the glowing blade deep into the gap between its armored plates. And the creature let out a final roar that shook the ground before it collapsed, sending a wave of dust and debris into the air. With their great beast fallen, the swarm began to break, and their movements lost all order as they scattered in every direction, and the humans pressed forward with the Drevians beside them, cutting down those who remained and driving the rest far from the city walls. And for the first time since the siege began, the ground beyond the gates was free of the enemy. The humans did not cheer, and they did not slow their movements until they were certain no enemy remained within range. And then they formed lines again, facing outward, watching the horizon, as if expecting the swarm to return at any moment, and their dropships hovered close above them, casting long shadows in the late sun. The Drevians began to gather their wounded and tend to the dead, and though the cost of the battle had been high, the victory was complete, and Rolter stood at the edge of the field looking out at the humans who had come from the sky and wondering again why they had chosen to fight here and what their presence meant for the future. The human leader walked toward him, their armor still marked from the fight, and the glowing blade now dark at their side, and they spoke only once as they passed, saying the city is safe for now, before moving on to rejoin their soldiers, and Rolter was left standing in the fading light with more questions than answers. That night the fires of battle burned low, and the city was quiet, but beyond the walls the humans still stood, watched their dark forms unmoving against the horizon, and in the sky their great ships waited like silent guardians, ready to move again whenever the call came. The dawn after the final battle came quietly with pale lights spilling across the walls, and the air was cool and still, and the Drevians walked slowly through the streets, as if unsure whether the danger had truly passed, and they looked often toward the gates where the humans still stood in black armor, like statues of metal and shadow. Outside the walls, the battlefield lay silent, with the bodies of the Zarkals scattered across the scorched earth, and the smoke from the fires now thin and drifting away into the high sky, and in the distance the great dropships floated unmoving in perfect lines like guardians that would never leave their post, and the sight filled the hearts of the people with a strange mix of gratitude and fear. Rolter stepped out onto the wall and let his gaze move across the quiet field, remembering every moment of the siege and the hopelessness that had grown in the hearts of his soldiers before the humans had come, and he thought again of that first sight when the ships had broken through the clouds, and the black armored warriors had fallen from the sky into the heart of the battle, without hesitation and without fear. The human leaders stood apart from their warriors at the edge of the field, speaking into a device on their arm, and their voice was low and calm, though Rolter could not hear the words, and after a moment they turned and began walking toward the city gates, and the guard stepped back to let them pass, though the leader did not enter, but stopped just inside the shadow of the wall. "We will leave soon," the leader said, and their voice carried a weight that made every word feel important. "Our mission here is complete." Rolter wanted to ask what mission they spoke of, but before he could they continued, saying, "Your people are strong, and you have endured much, but there will be more battles to come, not only with the Zarkal, but with others who wait beyond your borders, and when that time comes you must remember what you have seen here." The Drevians who had gathered nearby listened in silence, and though the words were simple, They felt like a command and a promise, and Rolter could see in the faces around him that they understood, even if they did not fully know the meaning. The humans began to move toward their ships in perfect order, their boots striking the ground in the same steady rhythm, and the sound echoed through the valley like the beat of a great drum. And as they passed the Drevians, they did not speak, but each warrior turned their head slightly, as if to mark the faces of those they had fought beside. The leader was the last to leave, and as they reached the base of the ramp to their dropship, they paused and looked back toward the city, and in that moment the sun broke through the clouds, casting a sharp light across the armor of the humans, and making them shine like blades drawn for battle, and the sight burned itself into the memory of everyone who stood there. The dropships began to rise slowly, their engines sending waves of dust and wind across the field, and the sound grew deeper and louder until it filled the air and the ground seemed to shake. And then with a burst of power, they lifted high into the sky and turned toward the horizon, their black shapes growing smaller and smaller until they vanished into the distance. The silence that followed was heavy and strange, and the Drevians stood looking at the empty sky for a long time before turning back to the work of repairing their city and burying their dead. And though the humans were gone, their presence still lingered like a shadow and a shield over the land. In the days that followed, stories of the humans spread quickly through every part of the city and beyond, and merchants and travelers carried the tale to far villages and distant outposts. And with each telling, the story grew stronger, and the image of the black armored warriors falling from the sky became a symbol of hope and defiance against any enemy that might come. Children played in the streets, pretending to be the warriors from Earth, and striking down invisible foes with sticks and wooden shields, and old veterans spoke in hushed tones of the discipline and precision they had seen, and how the humans had fought without fear and without hesitation, as if every battle was already decided before it began. Rolter often walked the walls at night, looking out at the quiet fields and the stars above, and wondering where the humans had gone and what battles they were fighting now. And he thought often of the words the leader had spoken and what it might mean for the Drevians to one day be called to another world to stand where the humans had stood for them. Months passed, and the city began to heal, and the walls were rebuilt stronger than before, and the people carried on with their lives. But the memory of the siege and the warriors who had come to save them did not fade, and in time it became part of the songs and the stories told at the great gatherings, and the name of Earth was spoken with respect and curiosity by people who had never seen its surface or its sky. In the great hall of the fortress, Rolter ordered that a wall be set aside to honor the humans, and on it were carved images of the ships descending through the clouds, and the black armored warriors standing side by side with Drevians against the endless wave of the swarm, and beneath the carvings were the simple words, "They came when we called, and we will come when they call." Years later, when the Zarkal rose again in another part of the galaxy, the Drevians answered the call from Earth, and their ships crossed the stars to stand beside the humans in battle. And those who saw them remembered the carvings and the promise that had been made in the shadow of the city walls. And they knew that the bond between the two worlds had been forged not in treaties or councils, but in the heat of a battle that neither side would ever forget. And so the legend began, and it traveled from world to world, carried by traders and soldiers and wanderers, and in every telling the black armored warriors from Earth fell from the sky once more into the heart of the fight, bringing with them the hope that even in the darkest hour someone will answer the call.